Thunder rolled over Rome like the voice of an enraged god, but not even the fury of the heavens could drown out the screams erupting from the emperor's private chamber. The marble hallways trembled, not from the clash of battle or the murmur of political debate, but from something much darker. The echo sweeping through the corridors spoke not of glory or victories, but of a perversion corroding the heart of the empire from within. Amidst this atmosphere, Senator Lucius Marcus stood motionless, a torch in his trembling hand, watching the light flicker against the polished stone walls, as if the shadows themselves resisted witnessing what was happening behind those doors. His breathing was ragged, and although he wished to close his eyes to escape the horror, the guards escorting him murmured with an unforgiving voice, "Hold it steady, Senator. The Emperor requires proper lighting." That order was not a simple command. It was a sentence. Behind the heavy doors, there was no ceremony, no banquet, no council of state. Something far more brutal was being consummated there. The shattering of innocence, disguised under the cloak of an imperial privilege that knew no bounds. The victim could be a girl of barely 14, who in an instant ceased to be a daughter, ceased to be a person, to become just another number, an entry in a ledger, a piece of meat destined to satiate the emperor's machinery of pleasure. And the fathers of Rome, those very men who had commanded armies, passed laws, and defended honor in the forum, found themselves reduced to torchbearers in the destruction of their own daughters. The paradox was so cruel it seemed like divine punishment. The empire that had conquered nations was now devouring its own families. The most terrifying part of this account is that we are not speaking of myth or rumor, but of history. For chroniclers and ruins have passed down to us the echoes of that era when perversion became custom and abuse became state policy. Thus began the era of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to all as Caligula, the Mad Emperor, he whose shadow still darkens the halls of Rome. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, one must look back to March of 37 AD, when the news of Tiberius's death swept through the palace galleries. All of Rome breathed a sigh of relief, like someone freed from an unbearable weight after decades of fear and oppression. The people, the Praetorian Guard, and even the Senate breathed in the sensation of a rebirth, believing that with the old tyrant's demise, the hope of a new era was dawning. Tiberius had reigned for 23 years, sowing paranoia, accusations of treason, and silences fraught with terror. His suspicions were invisible daggers that could cut short anyone's life, and the senators, exhausted from walking on knife edges, yearned for a fresh start. That beginning seemed to be embodied in a young man whose name evoked promise and hope. The son of Germanicus, the general most beloved by the legions, was not only an heir of imperial blood, but also a symbol of hope. The people called him Caligula, the little boots he had worn in his father's camps, when he was still a child running among leather tents and iron-stained swords. He was not a palace prince, but the son of soldiers, someone who had shared the mud of the battlefields and the hardships of the troops. The day of his ascension was celebrated with jubilation. The squares were filled with shouts and chants, as if Rome had finally found an heir worthy of Julius Caesar's charisma and Augustus's benevolence. Even the most hardened senators were moved to see him walk through the Curia with a youthful smile. Prayers of thanksgiving were written, animals were sacrificed on the altars, and in the markets he was compared to the dawn after an endless winter. During his first months, Caligula seemed to fulfill every expectation. He entered the capital not with the distrust of a tyrant, but with the generosity of a young man eager to be loved. He handed out bonuses to the legions, reduced taxes that were suffocating the people, and organized colossal games that bathed the Colosseum in gladiator blood for days. It was a spectacle that restored hope to the crowds, making the people dream that, at last, Rome had regained a human, smiling, and magnanimous leader. But behind that mask of radiant youth, the threads of a dark plot were already brewing. Barely perceptible at first, like tiny cracks in a perfect statue, they deepened until they became fractures impossible to hide. A servant girl disappeared from the palace kitchens. It was said she had fled, fearful of punishment, but rumors whispered that her body had been found in the Tiber, with wounds so grotesque that the guards refused to describe them. Shortly after, two other slaves, a 15-year-old boy and a 17-year-old girl, were found dead in the same river, their faces frozen in a grimace of eternal agony. In Rome, blinded by the enthusiasm of having a new emperor, chose to ignore those shadows. The emperor was still young, they said. Was it not natural for him to test the limits of his pleasures? Surely with time, he would learn responsibility. That was the consolation the senators repeated to themselves, trying to calm a fear that was already beginning to pulse beneath their skin. Those disappearances were only the prelude to something deeper and more terrifying. The empire that had given laws to the world was about to transform into a stage of degradation, and all of Rome would become a silent witness to the madness of a man who believed himself a god. When the news of Tiberius's death swept across the marbles of Rome in March of 37 AD, the city breathed a collective sigh that felt more like a rebirth than a simple transfer of power. After 23 years of suspicions and treason trials, of cold stares and deadly silences, the senators were exhausted from living under constant surveillance. The Praetorian Guard yearned for a new leader, and the citizens, tired of oppression, dreamed of feeling joy once again. Rome had grown so accustomed to walking on the edge of a knife that the arrival of a new prince seemed like a blessing sent by the gods. That prince was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, whose name resonated as both heritage and promise. However, the people did not call him by his official name. They knew him as Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname born in the camps of his father Germanicus, the general most beloved by the legions. As a mere child, Caligula would run among the ranks dressed in tiny military sandals, drawing smiles from battle-hardened soldiers. That childhood, steeped in the smell of leather and iron, had made him more than just an heir. It had forged him as the prince of the soldiers, the boy who grew up among common men rather than within the gilded walls of a palace. His rise to power was celebrated as if Rome had awakened from a nightmare. The crowd filled the forum with cheers, torches illuminated the night as if a new sun were burning, and the temples overflowed with sacrifices of thanksgiving. Hope spread like wildfire in dry fields. The senators spoke of him as the heir of Augustus, the grandson of hope, the one who would restore dignity to the throne. Merchants welcomed him like the dawn after a long drought, and even the Praetorian soldiers, accustomed to distrust, looked upon him with sincere devotion. In his first months, Caligula seemed to fulfill all those expectations. He did not come to power with the distrust of an elderly tyrant, but with the youthful brilliance of someone eager to be loved. He ordered bonuses to be distributed among the legions, a gesture that ignited the soldiers' loyalty. He reduced the taxes that suffocated the people and gave breathing room back to the families who had lived under Tiberius's pressure. He organized colossal spectacles, where gladiators fought relentlessly, filling the Colosseum with blood and cheers for endless days. Rome laughed again, dreamed again, and believed again that, at last, humanity had returned to the throne. Caligula's speeches drew tears of emotion in the Senate. His words, steeped in charisma, were applauded as if they were oracles. Some veteran senators, men hardened by decades of intrigue, wept upon hearing him, convinced they had been freed from the shadows. In the squares, people compared him to Julius Caesar for his energy and to Augustus for his benevolence. Temples filled with prayers and altars with sacrifices in a show of gratitude. All of Rome saw him as the dawn after a long, stormy night. But that dazzling light already hid fissures. The signs were small, almost invisible, like cracks in a newly carved statue. A slave girl disappeared from the palace kitchens. The steward claimed she had fled out of fear of punishment, but rumors circulated in the taverns about a corpse found in the Tiber, mutilated so gruesomely that the soldiers refused to describe it. Shortly after, a 15-year-old boy and a 17-year-old girl disappeared. Their bodies came floating back down the river, their faces petrified in an expression of indescribable agony. The palace offered no explanations. The emperor in public smiled as if nothing were happening, and the people, intoxicated by enthusiasm, preferred to close their eyes. "He is young," the senators murmured. "Every man of power tests his limits. With time, he will mature." These phrases were repeated like prayers, desperate attempts to ignore the fear already creeping beneath their senatorial tunics. It was easier to deceive themselves than to admit that the new dawn could turn into an eclipse. The true turning point arrived in October of 37 AD, barely 6 months after he had been acclaimed. Caligula fell ill suddenly and mysteriously. The news of his fever, his delusions, and his body writhing between life and death swept through Rome like lightning. The entire empire held its breath. Temples filled with priests, sacrificing oxen and pouring wine over the altars. Citizens prayed with trembling lips, begging the gods not to take their young emperor. Even the soldiers, men who had mocked omens and soothsayers, began to murmur prayers to Mars and Jupiter. The people feared that the hope that had barely sprouted would be torn out by the roots. The tension was unbearable. For weeks, no one knew if Caligula would live or die. Finally, the young emperor emerged from his bed. He was pale, weakened, but alive. All of Rome erupted in celebrations. Animals were sacrificed in gratitude. Banquets were organized in homes, and the Senate proclaimed his recovery a miracle of divine intervention. The city, which had been holding back, exploded in jubilation, believing the gods had heard their pleas. However, those closest to him swore that the man who rose from that bed was not the same one who had ascended the throne. Something inside him had broken, or perhaps caught fire. The fever had not left him grateful, but convinced that he had descended into death and returned as an immortal. From that moment on, Caligula no longer saw himself as a mere man, subject to laws and morality. He believed himself a living god, freed from any human boundary. That delusion marked the beginning of a point of no return. What had started as exuberant youth and generosity transformed into a dangerous conviction. The idea that divinity granted him absolute right over bodies, lives, and destinies. Rome celebrated his recovery, but what had truly been resurrected was not a human prince, but a maddened god who would begin to drag the entire city into an abyss of horror. What were, at first, isolated rumors, small cracks in the young emperor's mask, soon transformed into deep fissures impossible to hide. After his miraculous recovery in the fall of 37 AD, Caligula began to show a different face, a cold stare that had replaced the youthful smile that had so thoroughly won over the people. That fever, according to those close to him, had burned something inside him. He was no longer a man grateful for life, but someone convinced he had passed through death and returned as an immortal. That conviction freed him in his own mind from all human law, from all morality, from any limit. In the beginning, his excesses seemed to hide behind the glamour of palace banquets. Senators and their wives were invited to private dinners they could not refuse. At these gatherings, husbands were left powerless, knowing the invitation meant surrendering their wives to the emperor's will. No one dared to question him, for doing so amounted to a death sentence. Young men from noble families were also summoned with the apparent honor of serving in the court. However, the honor soon revealed itself as a mask. The boys were forced to paint their lips, dress in silks, and become living ornaments destined for public humiliation. The city, still intoxicated by hope, looked the other way. The same excuse was repeated. He was young, and the indulgence would pass. But the indulgence did not fade. Instead, it transformed into a ritual. The court was purged and replaced not by men of honor, but by soldiers chosen for their cruelty. Loyalty was no longer secured by military oaths, but by complicity in depravity. Violence and perversion became the new bonds of fidelity. One of the names that emerged during this stage was Helen, a freedman who soon rose to the title of Master of Pleasures. This man quickly understood that his survival depended on satisfying the emperor's whims, no matter how obscene they were. Helen became a purveyor, a hunter of victims, the shadow moving through Rome selecting bodies for imperial fantasies. Under his direction, the palace ceased to be a space of government and became a clandestine market for human flesh. By the summer of 38 AD, Caligula's transformation was already evident. A new type of record began to appear in the imperial archives. They were not tax lists or grain inventories, but human catalogs. With the same bureaucratic precision with which Rome calculated its resources, the names of women and children were now recorded, stripped of identity, reduced to numbers. Daughters of senators, wives of knights, children of merchants, all became entries in a ledger. Each was classified by age, beauty, or utility. And with that, the dignity of Rome was shredded into columns of ink. What had started as rumors of disappearances and corpses thrown into the Tiber was institutionalized as state policy. The emperor's private perversion transformed into public machinery, a cold system where the administration was dedicated to the acquisition, classification, and use of human beings. Rome, which had boasted of civilization, descended into a market of dignity auctioned off to the whim of a single man. The senators, who in the past had dictated laws and led armies, began to walk the palace halls with empty stares. Everyone understood that their families had become bargaining chips, hostages to the imperial will. Refusing a decree could mean seeing a daughter's name inscribed in that registry. Resisting a tax could equate to handing over one's own wife. Even silence did not guarantee protection. It only delayed the inevitable. Caligula's cruelty was not satisfied with destroying bodies. It penetrated the most intimate core of society, family ties. The emperor knew that the most devastating blow was not against strangers, but against those bonds that had been the foundation of Rome for centuries. His hunger was not satiated by strangers. He needed to break the untouchable, to prove that no relationship, not even that of father and daughter, was safe from his power. Thus, what had begun with missing slaves and corpses thrown into the river transformed into a calculated system of terror. The flames of the torches, which had once illuminated the empire's victories, now shed light on scenes of degradation that corroded the very essence of Rome. Politics was no longer decided in the forum or in military campaigns, but in the chambers of the palace, where pain was turned into spectacle and humiliation into obedience. All of Rome became a silent accomplice. The people chose blindness, the senators chose submission, and so what should have been a luminous dawn transformed into the prelude to an endless night. What had begun as a private vice hidden within the palace walls soon transformed into official policy. Caligula understood that the true strength of his power lay not only in the ability to humiliate in secret, but in turning that humiliation into a spectacle, into a public mechanism that forced everyone to participate. The perversion, which was previously whispered in hallways and hinted at in rumors, became written doctrine, organized and executed with military precision. The palace architects received unusual orders. They were not to design rooms of beauty, but acoustic torture chambers. Each space was calculated so that the victim's screams would travel clearly through the corridors, ensuring that those waiting their turn could not escape the echo of what awaited them. Suffering was not just a physical act. It had to become a psychological poison that penetrated the minds of everyone present. In those rooms, the light of the torches was more than illumination. It was an instrument of power. The guards placed the torchbearers in exact positions, calculating the height and distance of the flames so that nothing remained in the shadows. The emperor insisted that the witnesses were just as important as the victims, because degradation only reached its true value when it was seen, shared, and transmitted. Thus was born the most cruel and symbolic figure of Caligula's system, senators forced to become torchbearers, men who had dictated laws, commanded armies, and defended the honor of Rome, were reduced to living statues, paralyzed, holding the fire that illuminated the violation of their own children. The guards trained them with military precision. They had to learn where to stand, how long to hold their arms steady, how to endure without blinking. They were warned that a slight tremor, a protest, or an averted gaze meant the immediate condemnation of another member of their family. The discipline once demanded in war was now applied to domestic humiliation. The palace hallways began to fill with hand-carved inscriptions by these desperate men. Fragments of words scratched into the marble walls read, "We are the condemned who breathe," or "May the gods forgive what emperors compel." Those marks, discovered centuries later by archaeologists, spoke not of heroic resistance but of despair, of the need to leave a record that they had been forced, that their silence had not been voluntary. The psychological effect of this system was devastating. Fathers turned into involuntary accomplices, returned to their homes with vacant stares. Their children could no longer look them in the eye, not because they blamed them, but because the memory was unbearable. Families fractured in silence. The bonds that had sustained Rome for generations rotted from within. Mothers desperately hugged their youngest children, dreading the moment they would be claimed. Sons grew up with the shadow of suspicion toward their own fathers, knowing that the one who had held the torch could be called upon to do so again. In this way, Caligula achieved what no external enemy had ever managed, transforming love into a weapon and the family into a field of control. Corruption no longer affected only the body, but also the soul of Rome. Fear spread like an invisible poison that corroded every home, every marriage, every bond. Testimonies of the time describe how people in the markets whispered stories of noble women who had entered the palace and never returned, of sons from respected families who came back transformed into painted and perfumed shadows, stripped of their identity. Everyone knew the truth, but no one dared to speak it aloud, because to speak was to attract attention, and to attract attention meant being included in the registry. Caligula's system operated on a perverse logic. The more silence it produced, the stronger it became. Every father who obeyed, every senator who stayed quiet, reinforced the machinery. The emperor did not need to watch everyone. It was enough for each family to watch itself, broken by shame and fear. The macabre genius of this method lay in the fact that it not only destroyed the victims, but transformed all of Rome into an army of terrified witnesses, incapable of rebelling because they were trapped in their own complicity. Archaeologists, centuries later, found fragments of those imperial records. In them, the reduction of lives to simple annotations could be read with chilling coldness. Item 247, female, senatorial class, restricted use. Behind those dry words were shattered families, children mutilated in spirit, and a society that had betrayed itself. It was the bureaucracy of horror, the triumph of administration over humanity. Thus, Rome ceased to be an empire of outward conquest to become an empire of internalized terror. Legionaries no longer defended borders, but guarded hallways where the souls of their own compatriots were broken. Senators, once guardians of dignity, became trembling shadows illuminating the destruction of what they loved most. And the citizens, by looking the other way, sealed with their silence the complicity of an entire city. What had started as hidden perversion had been institutionalized. The horror was no longer a rumor, it was procedure. And what was once an individual sin had transformed into an official machinery that corroded the essence of Rome from within. Among all the horrors Caligula unleashed upon Rome, none proved as disturbing as his obsession with breaking the most sacred bond of society, the family. Until then, he had humiliated the wives of senators, reduced the children of merchants to mere entries in a ledger, and turned slaves and nobles into pieces of an inventory. But the madness that dominated him aimed even deeper, toward his own blood, toward those who had shared childhood games with him, and who carried the heritage of Augustus in their veins. Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger were his sisters. Women who, by right of birth, represented the untouchable dignity of the imperial family. To touch them meant violating the very heart of Rome. But Caligula did not stop. For him, corrupting the inviolable was not just an expression of desire, but a political weapon, a spectacle designed to show that no limit, not even that of blood, could contain his power. The scandal came to light in the most brutal and public way possible. One night, during a banquet attended by 300 senators, priests, and ambassadors from foreign kingdoms, Caligula decided to reveal his secret. The hall shone with golden lamps, the musicians tried to hide the tension floating in the air with their melodies, and the forced smiles of the guests barely managed to cover their fear. The emperor, reclining on his divan, took his sister Drusilla by the hand and drew her toward him in a gesture that shattered all the laws and customs of Rome. The room froze. No one dared to look straight ahead. Some senators fixed their eyes on their goblets. Women gripped their golden cups until their knuckles turned white. Everyone understood that what was unfolding before them was not simply a private scandal, but a public sacrilege. Then Caligula's voice echoed through the hall with solemn calm. My divine sisters, blessed by Jupiter, share my affection just as Juno shares hers with him. Invoking the incest between Jupiter and Juno was no accident. With that declaration, he transformed his crime into a religious act, forcing the senators to applaud or commit treason. And so they did. Hollow clapping, forced applause that sealed Rome's fate with a complicit silence. The bond with Drusilla was not new. During the fever that nearly killed him in 37 AD, she had been the only one authorized to remain in his room, while priests and doctors were expelled. After his recovery, Caligula proclaimed her not only his sister, but his divine counterpart. He installed her in the quarters reserved for wives and banished Drusilla's husband to a distant post that amounted to exile. From then on, she presided by his side at morning audiences, shared religious ceremonies with him, and became the centerpiece of his private rituals. Julia Livilla, of a rebellious spirit, tried to resist, but reprisals soon silenced her. Agrippina, more cunning, hid her fury and waited in silence, memorizing every humiliation with the hope of taking revenge in the future. But in the meantime, both were forced to play a grotesque role in the theater of their brother's depravity. All of Rome became a mute spectator to this tragedy, and the sisters, involuntary actresses in a spectacle of degradation. When Drusilla became pregnant, Caligula's madness reached its apotheosis. Standing before the Senate, dressed in purple and gold, he proclaimed that the child she carried in her womb was not a mere mortal, but the heir of a god, destined to rule heaven and earth. The senators, whose voice had guided the empire for centuries, bowed their heads in ritual obedience. Decrees of honor were passed for the unborn child, and priests offered sacrifices in the temples, obeying the absurd order to venerate as a miracle what was, in reality, the most scandalous proof of imperial corruption. The people were forced to pray for the infant's health. In Rome, which had once been the cradle of laws and dignity, became an accomplice in the desecration of its own foundations. However, destiny intervened. In June of 38 AD, Drusilla died suddenly. Some whispered of childbirth complications. Others, in hushed tones, spoke of poison administered by hands that could no longer bear further humiliation. The truth remained buried with her. Death brought no relief. Caligula, devastated, lost the last fragments of humanity he had left. He declared Drusilla a goddess, ordered temples to be raised in her honor, and demanded that oaths be sworn invoking her divinity. The people had to worship the woman he himself had destroyed. Thus the victim was transformed into a state religion. For Julia Livilla and Agrippina, the tragedy did not end, but multiplied. Now they were forced to imitate Drusilla, to dress in her clothes, to repeat her words, to embody her spirit in ceremonies that turned mourning into a grotesque parody. To resist meant death. To obey equated to total degradation. The emperor used her memory to prolong the torment, and the surviving sisters were his instruments. Witnesses later recounted how, in public rituals, senators were summoned to witness Caligula's divine union with his sisters. Before them, the emperor would proclaim, "If I can do this with my own blood, imagine what awaits your daughters." The message was unequivocal. No family was safe. No bond, however sacred, could withstand absolute power. In the imperial archives, scribes recorded these events with the same coldness with which they logged taxes or grain supplies. Dates, names of witnesses, brief observations. The bureaucracy turned incest into an administrative act, erasing the humanity of the victims in columns of figures and words. Rome, in silence, accepted the desecration of the most basic idea of its society, the family. Caligula's incest was not just a personal perversion, but a political statement. By destroying the concept of family, he destroyed the pillar upon which Rome had built its greatness. The paternal home, which had been the heart of law and tradition, became a stage for humiliation and control. And in that public violation, all of Rome became an accomplice. With the death of Drusilla, far from calming down, Caligula's madness reached a new level of systematization. The emperor was no longer content with private scandals or incestuous rituals. His ambition was to transform degradation into an institution, abuse into a religion, and exploitation into a mechanism as cold and orderly as the imperial treasury. It was then that the so-called Temple of Divine Service was born, one of the most perverse inventions of his reign. The eastern wing of the imperial palace, decorated with ceilings painted with scenes of nymphs and goddesses, was converted into a false sanctuary. At first glance, it seemed like a place of piety, smoking altars, perfumed incense, and sacred hymns echoing between golden walls. But behind the velvet curtains, there was no devotion, only a perfectly organized machinery of abuse. The wives and daughters of senators were no longer invited in secret. They were processed as if they were offerings, disguised under the mask of a sacred rite. The emperor had found a way to conceal humiliation beneath the language of religion. Each ceremony was meticulously documented. Scribes noted on scrolls not only the names of the women and children, but also their time of service, their reactions, and the revenue generated for the treasury. The temple operated with the efficiency of a tax office. Every act of degradation was recorded in duplicate, sealed, and stored in the imperial archives. Cruelty was no longer a secret, it was a statistic. The system was even more sinister because it directly implicated the elite of Rome. Senators seeking imperial favors received ivory tokens with schedules and room numbers. With these, they were summoned to ceremonies where their own wives and daughters were surrendered to the ritual. Attendance was mandatory. The message was clear. The dignity of their families was the price to pay for contracts, promotions, or political protection. Once inside, they could not rebel because the written records became eternal proof of their complicity. No man could raise his voice after having been there. The evidence of his silence transformed into chains. Even with all this, Caligula was not satisfied. His imagination, fueled by a delusion of absolute control, sought to guarantee the supply of victims not only for the present, but also for the future. From this arose a monstrous program, the systematic breeding of human beings. Physicians trained in Alexandria, men who had sworn to heal, were forced to become fertility inspectors. They measured hips, examined family histories, and evaluated reproductive potential as if dealing with livestock. Young women of the senatorial class were forcibly paired with soldiers, gladiators, or even foreigners, depending on which combinations promised beauty, strength, or exotic features. The matings took place under the watchful eyes of guards and scribes, who took note of every detail with the coldness of accountants. Pregnancies were monitored with obsessive precision. Diets were imposed, movements were restricted, and miscarriages were punished as if they were crimes against the state. Every birth was noted in the records not as a miracle of life, but as a classified product. Newborns were snatched from their mothers and assigned according to categories: strong males destined for the army, those with delicate features for palace service, attractive girls for the temple of divine service, and the less favored for heavy labor. There was no family, only inventory. The most grotesque project was the one imposed on the sons of the noblest families. These boys, who were meant to become the future leaders of Rome, were torn from their natural destiny to be transformed into living ornaments of the palace. The feminization of the sons of Rome became a common practice. In the mirror-lined halls of the North Wing, teenagers were forced to watch their metamorphosis while servants bathed them in perfumed oils, plucked away their childhood with tweezers, and dressed them in silk tunics. Their hair was braided with flowers, their faces were painted, and they were trained to speak in high-pitched voices and move with artificial grace. Their original names, Marcus, Lucius, Gaius, were erased, replaced by Flora, Lilia, or Rosa. The records no longer described them as sons of Rome, but as male attendants, accompanied by evaluations of beauty, obedience, and grace. They were turned into merchandise, displayed as trophies at banquets where the very same senators had to classify them, hypocritically selecting the sons of their colleagues. Refusing to participate amounted to public punishment. Obeying meant destroying one's own heirs. In both cases, the future of Rome was bleeding out. The boys who were supposed to grow up to lead legions were broken in their adolescence, forced to become painted shadows, stripped of their identity before reaching maturity. Fragments of archives found centuries later reveal the chilling precision of this system. They contain not only names and ages, but also recommendations for optimization. One note suggested increasing production before festivities. Another praised the economic benefits of younger slaves. A third proposed supplying narcotics to improve the docility of the most rebellious. Human suffering was analyzed with the logic of an accountant calculating profit and loss. By the end of 39 AD, the palace no longer looked like a center of government, but a factory of human exploitation. There were departments for acquisition, processing, classification, breeding, and training. Guards ensured the supply, doctors guaranteed functionality, scribes recorded every detail, and senators, trapped in the circle of silence, kept the machinery moving. What began as an individual perversion had become a public institution. At the heart of this system, the very concept of family had been dissolved. There was no birth that did not become a record, no child who was not reduced to a category, and no mother who was not separated from her child. Caligula had achieved what seemed impossible, transforming the most natural and sacred act of humanity, familial love and new life, into a machinery of perpetual servitude. Rome, proud to be the cradle of law and civilization, had fallen into the most brutal paradox. While decrees were debated and goods were traded in the Forum, the true empire was being written on scrolls where flesh and pain were reduced to numbers. Among all the aberrations created by Caligula, none reflected the magnitude of his madness as clearly as the invention of the so-called torch system. It was a practice designed to destroy not only bodies, but also souls, turning fathers into involuntary accomplices in the annihilation of their own children. It was the final blow to Roman dignity, the ritual that sealed the transformation of the empire into a theater of horror. The procedure began with a cold edict, drafted in the bureaucratic tone of the imperial office. At dawn, a senator or magistrate would receive a sealed order. He was to go to the palace accompanied by his eldest unmarried daughter. The document also informed him that he must prepare to serve in the imperial illumination. Behind those impersonal words hid the certainty of ruin. Refusal meant not only the immediate death of the father, but the complete annihilation of the family. Wives enslaved, sons executed, lineage erased. Obedience, therefore, was not a choice, but a condemnation disguised as duty. The corridor where these men waited was a marble hallway over 50 feet long, lined with iron brackets where lit torches were inserted. Each bearer had to stand at precise intervals, calculated by architects so that the light would fall directly onto the interior of the chamber when the doors opened. There was no possibility of looking away. The architecture itself had been designed as a psychological weapon, forcing fathers to watch what was happening to their daughters. The guards watched with the rigidity of a centurion on the battlefield. They instructed the senators on how to hold the torch, how long to remain motionless, and how to keep their arms steady without yielding to tremors. They warned that any hesitation would be paid for with the immediate inclusion of another family member's name in the imperial registry. The discipline that once forged armies was now used to train silence and powerlessness. Inside those chambers, screams mingled with the creaking of doors and the muffled sound of held breath in the hallway. Some fathers muttered verses of Virgil in a desperate attempt to escape mentally. Others solved mathematical calculations to abstract themselves from the torment. But nothing could silence the sobs that pierced the walls. And meanwhile, their daughters were reduced to living ashes of dignity. The walls of the corridor still bore witness to that desperation. With trembling fingernails or fragments of metal, senators engraved phrases into the marble. "We are the breathing damned," or "May the gods forgive what emperors compel." Those words, found centuries later by archaeologists, are scars of stone, mute proof that the men who were once the masters of Rome had been transformed into empty shadows. The consequences were devastating, not only for individuals, but for society as a whole. The fathers who returned to their homes were no longer the same. They could not look at their daughters, not because they blamed them, but because the memory was unbearable. Families broke apart in silence. Mothers hugged their youngest children, fearing they would soon be called. Sons looked at their fathers with suspicion, knowing that the one who had held the torch could do it again. The family, the core of Rome, had become a field of invisible ruins. Some men, unable to bear the shame, sought wine until they lost consciousness. Others threw themselves on the swords they had once wielded in glorious victories. But the majority survived, walking the streets of Rome like specters, breathing without living, enslaved by the memory of the corridor. The system did not only destroy the direct victims, it poisoned every bond, every home, every shred of trust. The cruelty lingered even after the palace doors closed. The daughters who returned could never meet their father's eyes. It was not guilt, but a memory too heavy to be shared. In those houses, silence became the only possible language. The father, who had once been a protector, was now a symbol of destruction, not by choice, but because survival had forced him to obey. That psychological poison seeped into every home, multiplying the tragedy across all social classes. When Caligula was finally assassinated in January of 41 AD, pierced by the swords of his own praetorians in a theater, the system did not die with him. The records remained in the archives, and the iron brackets stayed embedded in the palace walls, like silent monuments to degradation. Centuries later, archaeologists would discover fragments of those scrolls where the names of senators' daughters had been transformed into numbers, and remnants of inscriptions that confirmed the accounts of ancient chroniclers. Caligula's true legacy was not just his individual madness or the brutality of his excesses, but the way he turned humiliation into an administrative procedure. The torch system was the culmination of his vision, transforming love into a weapon, the family into a theater of torture, and obedience into complicity. Rome, which had conquered the world, surrendered to a single man not with swords, but with silence. Thus, the empire crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Because the greatest innovation of Caligula's depravity was not his unbridled lust or his public incest, but having dressed evil in the mask of administration. He turned perversion into a ritual, cruelty into a norm, and humiliation into a system. And in that process, he dragged the soul of Rome with him into the darkness. When the daggers of the Praetorians pierced Caligula's body in January of 41 AD, Rome believed that with the tyrant's death, the horrors of his reign would also vanish. However, the reality was more bitter. Killing the man did not erase the system he had created. The iron brackets remained firmly in the palace hallways, the scrolls with cold records stayed in the archives, and the invisible scars on Roman families remained open long after his assassin stopped breathing. Archaeologists of later centuries found material evidence that confirmed the ancient accounts. They found fragments of records in which a senator's daughter was reduced to item 247, discovered walls with inscriptions engraved by desperate fathers, and located the torch bases placed with mathematical precision to guarantee a view of the horror. Each discovery spoke not of imperial glory, but of shame petrified in marble and bronze. The wound Caligula left was not solely political. Rome had known cruel emperors, bloody intrigues, betrayals, and assassinations before. What distinguished his reign was the way he managed to transform private perversion into public bureaucracy. He turned humiliation into a file, pain into a statistic, and rape into an administrative procedure, and that is the most devastating mark of his legacy, the capacity of a system to perpetuate evil beyond the life of a single man. The scars were passed down from generation to generation, daughters who trembled at storms because they reminded them of those nights of screams mixed with thunder, sons who grew up incapable of exercising leadership because they had seen their fathers reduced to torchbearers, entire families who preferred to stay quiet, bearing the memory under layers of silence because remembering was unbearable. Thus the empire dragged an invisible shadow that weighed more than any military defeat. The true collapse of Rome under Caligula did not occur at the borders or on the battlefields, but in the very heart of its society. By corrupting the family, by transforming love into a weapon and obedience into complicity, the emperor destroyed the most solid foundation upon which Roman greatness had been built. When fathers were forced to witness the destruction of their children, when mothers saw pain turned into a ceremony, the essence of Rome was broken forever. That is why, when we speak today of the most horrific sexual practices of Caligula the Mad, we are not repeating rumors of decadence or sensationalist anecdotes. We are facing the abyss of a system that transformed dignity into a spectacle, the family into a theater, and survival into a condemnation of silence. The remains of the palace, the torch brackets still embedded in the stone, the desperate inscriptions are echoes of a lesson that must not be forgotten. Because the greatest danger in history is not just absolute power, but when that power dresses itself in the mask of administration and turns destruction into routine. When evil becomes a procedure, when humiliation is archived on scrolls and violence becomes a statistic, It is no longer about a demented individual, but a machinery capable of devouring entire generations. Rome never fully recovered. Caligula's shadow continued to weigh on the empire like a mute warning. And as we look back, we must recognize that the fragility of civilization does not lie in its armies or its walls, but in its capacity to resist the temptation to turn cruelty into a system. The echo of this history still resonates in the empty hallways of the palace, where the rusted brackets seem to whisper in silence what happened under their light. Perhaps in those ruins there still remains the warning that Rome learned too late, that when humanity surrenders to madness and transforms it into a procedure, what collapses is not just a throne, but the very essence of the human condition. And if this story has disturbed you, if it has revealed how fragile civilization can become when morality surrenders to the delirium of power, remember that history does not disappear. It warns.